Hello everybody, this is BKC back in from the depths, and today what I want to talk about is it's kind of a weird topic, and it kind of gets into it kind of combines a lot of things, and it's engine slicing, slicing your engine, how the slices go together, and it kind of relates to your core, what I would call your core packing. The community kind of calls it Tetrising, and I really don't consider it Tetrising because in Tetris, the game Tetris, you have different size blocks, and you try to fit them together for the most efficient, space usage. But when you're talking about all cubes here, there's no Tetrising to do. But I understand where they get the terminology from, because instead of different shapes, you have different functions, and you're trying to balance out how these functions combine with each other. So I just call it packing the core, and you do that by slices of your motor. And I noticed this. What made me realize, pick this as a topic, I was looking at some of my older motors, and these older motors right here are designed from let's see, I think this one, yeah, and these four right here were designed right after the new engine system came out, and I still had the mindset of the old engine system, and I really didn't know what was going on. I was just trying to figure all this efficiency out, and these motors are just like, they're just ugly. They don't look good. They look like little, I would call them spaghetti monsters, because they're so packed with weird facing turbos, breaking of the binding box, because the motor would be unviable without violating the binding box here or violating the binding box here. And I spent sometimes hours maybe even weeks working on these motors, trying to pack all this stuff in, and I would get to a point where I would just be repacking it and repacking it and repacking it and repacking it, and realize that I'm going in circles and there's no viable option to do it in the space that I want, and I'd have to violate the binding box somewhere. So I kind of was going back, and really out of these four motors, this is the only motor right here that I would say is a good motor. Something worth keeping, and it's a 7x7x3, which is kind of unique, and it makes 800 horsepower, but it achieves an A efficiency. And one of the advantages of this is that it only uses one slice. Matter of fact, it's this slice, the most common slice available in the old system and this new system, and it's stackable front to back. You could put another motor on side of it and just remove this crossover pipe and put another motor right on side of it. It's symmetrical front to back and side to side. So this is a unique motor, so I don't really include this one, but these three, they're hard to improve on any, and I've kept them because I haven't built anything better at the time. But I think it's this one right here. If we go right out the gate, this is a 1600 horsepower 5-cylinder, making 320 power per cylinder, in a 7x7x5. Okay, well, this is something after I got a little bit more understanding, a 9-cylinder 1600 horsepower with the B rating in a 4x5x8. That's 160 binding box. This one is 147. Well, no, not that one. This one. 245. So 245 versus 160. So I've got this almost the same performance in a smaller space, and it's a more attractive to look at motor. It doesn't scream just like you just threw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall and made it work. A bowl of spaghetti at the wall, and this is what came out. This looks like it was actually designed. So I kind of wanted to see why. And then the motor that I had over here that had one fatal flaw that I took out before I built these beam motors, I'm almost to the point where I've gotten these obsoleted. I kind of wanted to see where my thinking was going back then versus where my thinking is now. And what I came up with is today's topic of your core slices, and it kind of combines in a little bit with sharing, power per cylinder, and having less carbs with more cylinders or more carbs with less cylinders. It's kind of a multi faceted episode, but I kind of narrowed it down to slicing, and this was the most common layout from the depths because of the fact that the engine block only has one connection point. You have to put a crank on, and since the crank has 4 sides, the most logical thing is to put 4 cylinders and then use the wasted space between them to share carbs. So this is probably the most used engine slice in from the depths, and with good reason, because it makes 800 horsepower with 4 cylinders, and it reports as 8 carbs even though it only has 4, because we have 4 carbs that share with 2 cylinders. And if we'd run this motor, it gets 9.6 fuel, and if we look at the cylinder information, each cylinder sees 2 carbs and has, if we would start stacking this, we would get 2 exhausts usable, the top one and the one sticking down, because the one here would be blocked off by a carb or another cylinder, or some other part. So we would only be able to use 2 exhausts here. So even if we got double sharing here, each one doubled our output, then it would be 4 exhausts per cylinder, which is pretty good, and that's why this is probably one of the most used. And so I wanted to see what the difference is in the new system from the old system. And the new system, the only other option that makes sense is this, which essentially we're replacing carburetors with cylinders and cylinders with carbs. But to do that, we need adapters to get the cylinders on the end, and that takes up a place where 2 carbs can go. So we end up with only 400 horsepower, 4 cylinders, still same, but we're making half the power in the same space. It shows 4 carbs when we only got 2, kind of the same here. We're just doubling our carbs because we got 2 carbs with 2 cylinders per carb. And if you run this motor, it runs 4.8 fuel a second, which is exactly half of that motor. So we're making half the power, we're using half the fuel. So in terms of efficiency, if you want, if you go space efficiency, it's not as efficient because it's making less power. If we want to go from fuel efficiency, it's more efficient because it's using less fuel. But if you want to go power per fuel numbers, I think they're exactly the same. I didn't test them, but I think they're going to be exactly the same. So we're just using the same space to make less power and use less fuel. So these are our 2 core layouts. These are the most common, and I really don't see much other than this in any design, really. My 3T is just taking this cylinder off right here. This motor is my 3T with the bottom cylinders removed and just repeated this way. This 5-cylinder is just this layout with the 5th cylinder on top. This cylinder is just this layout with the most efficiency parts I could stack on it. This motor is the same as this layout, and you don't really see anything other than this. The only time you see anything other than this is if, like, you wanted to put, if we want to go out to a 5 cube for our core. But And from the depths, if you have a small motor, a small boat, you're going to need a small motor. And you can make an argument for any one of these, but my 3T always wins out in the space, and the it pretty much has the highest density, fuel economy, power, pretty much everything across the board. It usually wins out almost every single time I need a small motor, and I haven't really designed much better in the smaller motor class range. I kind of got to this and just was like, whatever, it's almost impossible to make better. I'm sure there is, but I just stopped trying. And if you go with really big motors, and you start getting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of parts stacked together, I kind of see on a big ship, there's the only place you would want to need that. And you only do that for two reasons. Either you need a lot of power, or you're just trying to get internet points with a super high fuel efficiency. And at that point, I would start arguing, unless you can protect that core motor block really well, you got this either really ultra efficient motor that takes up a lot of space, or a really powerful motor that takes up a lot of space, and you have one engine block that, if it gets destroyed, all power disappears. And in that case, you start getting into multiple motors, and it's better just to start sticking. Sometimes you might be better off with 2 of these, sometimes you might be better off with 4 of these, making the same power using the same fuel, but 4 of these has twice the redundancy of this, and this is more redundant than one big motor that takes up the same amount of space doing the same thing. So in big motors, there's more to decide than just the motor itself. I find that interesting is in your mid-size motors. Like pretty much most of my motors on the platform, they range in size and binding box, but a lot of times if you got a mid-size motor, a mid-size ship, and you can only put one motor, your choices start getting a little more interesting, because if you're only going to have one motor, you say, well, I'm going to want the most efficient, the most powerful in the space that I have. And that's kind of where this video lies. I don't want to bring it into, bring it out to a 5x5, because you could put a extra cylinder on each one of these adapters and bring it out to a 5 spaces. But I just wanted to keep for the mid. I'm talking about mid-size right now, and I really haven't experimented with a lot of the by 5 motors. I kind of did it here, and I'm just starting with these. But once I started doing this, I started learning that sometimes it's better to go with 2 motors in the same, I guess you'd say like a conjoined twin motor, where they're joined together by the exhaust, since they can't share power parts, but they could share exhaust parts. So I haven't really gone that far, and it starts getting really complicated, because if you put a cylinder here, it's like, well, do I put a carb here to carb here, or do I just do like a carb on one side but then put exhaust on the other, and it starts getting really complicated. So I wanted to stick to a 3x3 core layout design. And if you wanted to stack this, if you wanted to evolve these 2 designs, because we have vastly different designs in the same space, but if you wanted to evolve these and just stack them, add more slices to it, just copy this, repeat it, and just keep repeating it. The problem I see from building all these motors and learning how to put spaghetti and pack all that spaghetti in a space, I started looking at cores differently. And this has good ability to put turbos on it, because even if I took up this whole top space, I still got 3 connection points on each carburetor to collect exhaust, and then that doesn't violate the 2 exhausts that I could collect from each cylinder. And if I was to stack this and stack it, if I just stacked it once, it would be really inefficient use of exhaust, because I'd be killing 2 exhausts with 2 cylinders, but I'd still have 2 on this one and 2 on the next side. and it'd be really like wasteful. If I started stacking it up 3, 4, 5, and 6, only the 2 end caps would have 2 exhausts. All the cylinders in the middle would only have 1 exhaust. And even if it does share and doubles each exhaust to get 2 exhausts out, it's still kind of wasteful, because if I'm getting 2 exhausts in, then I can get 2 exhausts out of each one, or even 3 exhausts out of each one. That would be doubling it to 4 or 6. So stacking a slice like this wouldn't be useful. And if you wanted to keep the slice the same, you would end up with something like this. And you would basically space it out by 1. And you have 2 options. You could either collect exhaust, or you could put carbs in there and make more power. So I went the carb route, because I was actually investigating carbs per cylinder, and this is what I ended up with. I ended up with a 1200 horsepower 8-cylinder that makes 300 power per cylinder, and that's what I was trying to investigate. But I found something very boring and non-interesting, and so it turned into a carb layout and sharing tutorial. And what this motor sees is it sees 24 carbs, because we have 12 carbs that see 2 cylinders apiece. So each carb sees 2 cylinders. Every single carb on here sees 2 cylinders. Now if we look at it from a cylinder perspective, each cylinder sees 3 carbs, therefore we get the 300 power per fuel. So the carbs tell us what the carb count tells us, how many carbs, or how many cylinders each carb, how many carbs you have, which is 12, and how many cylinders they see times 12. But your power per cylinder tells you how many carbs each cylinder sees. And it's another way to see it is to go look at each cylinder. And if we do that, we'll see that each cylinder sees 3 carbs and 2 exhausts. It's symmetrical all across each one. Now, in the old system, this was okay, because we only had really 2 efficiency parts. We had the supercharger, and we had the fuel tank. And we could put a supercharger in here, and I think if you put a supercharger in here, it shows like 24 or 48 superchargers, but we've already established that stacking superchargers are not as efficient as turbos, and stacking a whole crap ton of superchargers in here to get 0 fuel when we're making at 1%, we would be making what, like 24 power. To make 0 fuel at 24 power, and then as soon as you get to 5% and all those superchargers start dropping off in efficiency, we start using fuel. That's not the best use case for our empty space here. And then the fuel tanks went away. And ideally, probably in the old system, you'd probably want to put a supercharger here, and a fuel tank here, and a fuel tank here, and kind of balance out the best of both. And that's kind of the way the old system went. And the old system was flawed in the fact that the more crap you put on it, the more power that it made, and the more efficient that it got at the same time. So as efficiency went up, so did power. They didn't buck each other. They should have made it to where the motors were just like, a little weed whacker motor, especially like a little four-stroke weed whacker motor can run hours and hours and hours and hours on just a couple of ounces of fuel, whereas a larger 12-cylinder Cummins turbo diesel, you can't even start that motor with less than like 16, 18 ounces of fuel just to start it. And that's how the old system should have been, but it wasn't like that. It was like the more power you made, the more fuel efficiency you got, and it was just kind of wasn't that great from a design perspective. There's no challenge to motors. You just figured out how to get the most power and the most efficient layout and just keep repeating that pattern over and over and over and over, and it just kept growing exponentially. So you'd have 1,000,000 horsepower motors using 0 fuel. But in the new system, if you do that, we have turbos, we have superchargers, we have all kinds of new parts, and we have different formulas. So In this particular case, what I look at from building all these bad motors, what I would see here is we have good sharing of carbs, and we only have 2 exhausts per cylinder. So if each cylinder sees 3 carbs, these should be 6 exhausts. So let's see, 6 is 40, so it should be about 48 exhausts. So technically we could probably get this pretty efficient, because we'd be collecting like 48 exhausts, and we would be pumping it into a turbo chain. But what concerns me here, I like the corner mounted carburetors, because we could just put 2 turbos here and here going up, here and here going up, and then if we could plumb it up right, we could actually turn these carbs up, put a supercharger on top to get it a little bit more efficient. We could do the same thing on the bottom. But what concerns me here is these carbs. If I put a turbo in here on this side of this coming out, it blocks off any access to this side of this carb, this side of this carb, this side of this carb. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to stack a turbo facing out radially on each one of these carbs, and then stack one on the flat face going this way radially. And I think I've done it in the past, and I think it conflicts too much. By the time you collect all your exhausts on the top, all your exhausts on the bottom, and then you mount all these turbos in a radial pattern around this thing, and then try to plumb them up with the turbos on the top, get the exhaust manifolds from the top and the bottom to connect, and then connect all the turbos serially on the top, all the serially on the bottom, and connect all these radials serially. It just becomes a nightmare, and it's not really that viable of a motor. You probably could violate a binding box here or there and make it viable, but I don't really think that even if if it comes out super efficient, I think that there's better designs that do the same job better than this. So taking just this slice and stacking it up, and just keep stacking it without any spaces is not the way to go. And then doing this, you could either collect more exhaust, which probably would be the better way to do this motor. Just collect all exhaust from the center, because then you can collect all exhaust and have you an exhaust ring in the wasted space. Put all your superchargers. You might even better get 3 turbos and superchargers in here with this layout. But then your power would go down. You'd actually get just 2 of these. It would just be a 1600 horsepower motor. But it might be a more viable solution to the problem we're looking for a mid-size motor that would have a 3x3 core with a 5x5 efficiency parts, because that's probably the most you could get density-wise for a mid-size craft. But that shows that, just keeping one layout doesn't really work the best. And then if we take this layout, which makes less power and less fuel, and we lay it out the same way, it's really just putting cylinders where carbs are on this motor and putting carbs where cylinders are, just swapping them out. But where this waste space, you can't put a cylinder here because there's no way to connect it to the crank. You'd have to lose carbs, which would lose power, but then you'd gain power back by putting cylinders here, and it just, I'm comparing the evolution of these slices. So what I ended up with is I tried to want it to match it. And I said, well, since it's making half the power, you probably can't match it. So I put a slice on the top. Some kind of way I turned it 90 degrees. I don't know how I did that. But I put the 2 slices, and I followed this same pattern. And I said, well, with this slice pattern, I could put carbs like this and use less carbs. And then there's just this wonderful opportunity to put a cylinder in right here and get 4 carbs per, 24 carbs per cylinder, getting more sharing. And what I found interesting, and then technically I could put another cylinder here and get another 400 horsepower. Yeah, 400 horsepower, and make this a 2800 horsepower motor. So yeah, it kind of would beat that. Or I could take those cylinders out and make it exactly the same. And that's what it came out to be. A 2400 horsepower 10 cylinder, and it reports as 24 carbs. 24 carbs, 24 carbs. But this one is doing it differently. It's inverting. It's taking less carbs and sharing it more. So, and then we end up with kind of an imbalance in this motor, where these motors, all the cylinders are balanced. This motor kind of ends up with an imbalance. And what it does is it makes 8 cylinders, sees 2 carburetors. The 8 on the corners see the 2 carbs on either side. But then they have 3 exhausts, because they have 3 exhausts available because they're corner mounted. And so that makes up 1600 of our power, and then this 2 single sole carbs here are making up the rest. And what they see is 2 cylinders see 4 carburetors but only have 1 exhaust. So from a design perspective and building a lot of bad motors, I know that this exhaust is going to be very, very, very important, because with 4 carbs going in, burning 4 times the fuel, this exhaust, these carbs are going to need efficiency parts to cut that fuel consumption down to this cylinder, but it's going to multiply 4 times. If I could get 2 carbs per cylinder, it's going to multiply 4 times. So it's going to see 8 turbos. So it's going to get 4 times more efficient. And this 1 exhaust is going to amplify more, but in the cooling formula, it's only going to count as 1 exhaust. So it's really important that these carbs get efficient, so we can cut the fuel down on this, so this doesn't run hot. So 1 exhaust can cool it, and then the carburetor will amplify it and turn it into 4 exhausts, which is pretty good. But so from a design perspective, I would say this is actually a little bit better if we could make it work. But what I see being problematic in this motor is this carb only has 2 exposed good sides, because we can't really use the one in between, because if I put a turbo on the bottom of this carb facing out, then I can't put one, I can't put another turbo in there to do a symmetrical, be symmetrical with this carb. So I only really have 2 good sides to work with on every carb. So I'm using less carbs to make more power. And so I'm going to need less efficiency parts. If I want 2 turbos per every carb on this motor, I'm going to need 24 turbos, which is going to take a lot of space on here to get 2 turbos per carburetor. We're only going to need 16, which is going to take less space. And then since each carburetor sees 3 cylinders, it's going to be passing that efficiency on 3 times. So from just looking at this core, I'm like, oh, this is the better way to go. I would never do this over this. But from building spaghetti motors, I know that the collection, the parallel collection exhaust side would be collect the tops, all the 3 exhausts from this side, all the 3 exhausts from this side, maybe connect them like right here where the adapter is wasting space, and then do that up here where the adapter is wasting space, do that up here and where they waste space, and do that on all 4 corners, and I would have 4 exhaust manifolds that need to be connected, which wouldn't be a problem because we probably could just put a supercharger in between these 2 carburetors, and since it's between these 2 carburetors, this one would see one supercharger, this one would see one supercharger, this one would see one supercharger. Well, this one would see two because they'd get one from both sides, and then all four on the corner would make less power would see one supercharger, and the one that makes double power would see two superchargers. So I'd probably just stick a supercharger in there and collect the top with the bottom manifolds, the parallel collection sides right here over the two superchargers, and that would be, you know, one side of the motor all connected with the other, and then I'd have to connect them left to right some kind of way. And then since the bottom has got the block in the way, you'd probably come over the top right here and connect the left side with the right side. So all four corners, all your parallel collection manifolds would be connected except for these two cylinders. Now, this is where the problem comes in. This technically could be a more efficient motor, but where we have a problem is with these cylinders. If I went to go around this way to go into the manifold, or I went diagonally into the top side of here, I'd have to use corner pipes, which would cover up this top of this carburetor. And there's no real good way to do it since we don't have diagonal pipes that don't take up space over the carbs. There's no way to make a cross pipe that wouldn't take up over the carb. Some kind of way this exhaust is going to take up one of my carb space, which is going to blow my symmetry, and we're going to lose efficiency some kind of way, and then I'm going to have to do it again on this side. So if I wanted to keep symmetry, I'm probably going to have to give up like all the exhaust on the top side, and that kind of defeats the purpose of sharing some of these carbs, because we're trying to double the exhaust and get more exhaust to our lesser amount of turbos to get more efficient quicker. And that's probably the Achilles heel of this motor, that one single cylinder. So that's what kind of kills this. But the interesting fact here is that they both make 2,400 horsepower. This is doing it with 8 cylinders, 300 power per fuel. This is doing it with 8 cylinders making 200 power per cylinder, and 2 making 400 to make the make it up. Now we could move those cylinders to here if we want to take them out here, and then put them over here, and we could lose I think 400 horsepower we would lose, and it'd be a 2,000 horsepower motor. But then this cylinder space would be opened up, and then you could still just put the supercharger in here, which would spread out between it would show, every cylinder would show 2 turbos, which would be more balanced, but we'd lose power. So this layout has one flaw, and it's mostly that singular exhaust, but they doing the exact same thing in the exact same space. This one's doing it with 8 cylinders, this one's doing it with 10 cylinders. And then what I found interesting, if we run it, it's 28.8 fuel usage. And of course, the power's dropping because it's overheat, because I didn't put no exhaust on it. But then this one, more cylinders, 28.8. It's doing the exact same thing. So density, efficiency, power, all that stuff's exactly the same. It's just which one's a better design. And looking at it, this one would be better. It's more flexible in my opinion, but looking at it, it has one fatal flaw right here. And to get around that fatal flaw, you'd move the cylinder over here, but then you'd drop power. So that's not, you know, evolving this up to this, what started out weaker ended up stacking better and catching up to this. So I know there's many different ways you could stack it. You could stack these same slices by putting different parts in different ways and stuff like that. But I just wanted to show that it kind of does the same exact thing. The parts don't really care. Their baseline efficiency is their baseline efficiency, and no matter whether you how you share carbs, and that's really what's important here, is that this is 12 carbs sharing 2 ways. This is 8 carbs sharing 3 ways. That's the difference here, and that's really what I wanted to investigate. But when I actually figured it out, guess what? They do the exact same thing. When you start tripling less carbs or doubling more carbs, it ends up being the exact same thing in the exact same space. The only difference between these is which is better to plumb up, which has better utilization of empty space, and the this one is better because it has corner mounted carbs, which is easier to get our efficiency parts connected to, but then these carbs kind of would suck. This one is better because it has the best point about this one is it has corner mounted exhaust, which is real easy to do our manifold side, our parallel side, but then it limits our serial side because of the turbos have less, I mean, the fewer carburetors have less connection points and limit us in a little, you have a higher amount of limitations. So I mean, if we put a turbo facing up on all of these cylinders, boy, then we're really limited because we can't, a carb has to go down and cover this exhaust, and if we do the radial pattern, all of our exhausts are going to be covering up. So it's making more exhaust, and more exhausts are available to us, but then we might have to actually give up some of them. So this would be making 6 exhausts per cylinder. This could potentially be making 6 exhausts per cylinder, but I would have to give them up. So that's the argument for this over this, but just looking at this, this looks like a better design. But if we want to try to get the best of both worlds, we're going to have to combine the slicing. And so what I did is I took this slice, top and bottom, and then I put this slice in the middle. And what we end up with is, the best thing about this is the 3 sides per carburetor for hooking up our efficiency parts. We have that here. The best part about this is it has less carburetors, which is 8, and they're sharing 3 ways. This has 8 and shares 3 ways. A good part about this is the corner mounted cylinders, we could collect more exhaust, but we have 2 contradicting things. This is good because of the corner mounted carburetors. This is good for the corner mounted cylinders. Well, in this design, it is ends up being 12 cylinders. 12 cylinders making 2,400 horsepower. It's a very even 200 power per cylinder, which is good for heat. No cylinders are going to run hotter than the other, and we won't drop off anything. But we couldn't quite maintain the balance of this motor. We still got a little bit of the imbalance of this motor, but it's not as gross as this motor. The imbalance is that 8 cylinders see 2 carburetors making 200 horsepower per cylinder and have 3 exhausts available to us, just like this motor. And then it has, 8 carbs sharing 3 ways, just like this motor. So there's no, that's kind of, hope that you kind of sees where if you carry some of the design of this motor over and carry some of the design of this motor, you're going to have to take on some of the, might have to take on some of the bads. But I did it in a way that it's not that bad, because 4 cylinders now, instead of having 2 cylinders making a lot of power and becoming the Achilles heel of the motor, I've got 4 cylinders seeing 2 carbs, so making the same power per cylinder, and they only see 2 exhaust. So that would be the 4 cylinders on the ends here that I put in the wasted, well, they're not wasted space, but they straddle these adapters, so they give up one of their exhausts. That's just how it worked out. But the advantage of this motor, you could see it right here, clear as day, that the empty space here, you could put a carb in here, but then you'd only have 1 connection point for efficiency parts, so that wouldn't be very good. You could put a cylinder here, but then you couldn't get no carbs to it. You have to violate the binding box to get a carb there, and then it would only make 100 horsepower, and you would block 4 exhausts, which is the advantage of this motor. The wasted space, you could just put 1 exhaust in there, and now we've collected 4 exhausts from 4 cylinders that all see 2 carbs. So this one pipe right here, for 1 exhaust pipe, we should be seeing 8 exhausts out here available for turbos. And then we had the benefit of the corner mounted turbos, so we could easily just put a turbo facing up, a turbo facing up, a turbo facing up on each corner. Down here go turbo facing down, and easily get 2 turbos per carburetor. So we've got the benefits of both motors. And the real benefit here is this. You put another exhaust in, another 5-way exhaust, and look what happens. The exhaust goes to collect another exhaust, and another exhaust, and another exhaust, and then when you put that exhaust, that's ready to come and collect this exhaust. So our parallel collection side just perfectly lays out. It becomes super, super easy. We could come up on both sides of this motor, wrap around to this side, wrap around to this side, and we'd have 2 manifold sides collecting every available exhaust on this motor. And then we could connect the sides. We only got 2 sides to connect. We could do it right here at the crank where the space is being wasted, no problem. And then all our exhausts are connected, super, super, super easy. All our turbos can go up like this. And be collected serial, very, very, very easy. And the parts just lay together and kind of want to be laid out this way. And this actually becomes the most efficient. And if we run it, like I said, it still makes 2,400 horsepower, and it uses 28.8 fuel, exactly the same as this and this. So in a 3x3x3 cube, we have 3 different options here, and it just goes to which one is better. What is a better core? And if you just ran them like this, just stuck exhaust on every available exhaust port, they would all use 28.8 fuel, and it would just be the difference of which one. This one would probably run hotter because we're sharing more carbs with cylinders, less cylinders. So the cylinders to make 2,400 horsepower are going to run hotter, which will make them lose a little bit of power. This one, if we ran it, that we got 2 cylinders that are making most of our power, almost as much as the rest of the motor. They're making up a third of our motor power. It would run really, really, really hot. It might even overheat. And then if we just put the exhaust on this thing would run ice cold. Because it's more balanced with only 200 power per cylinder using the same fuel, and it's dividing that up by more cylinders, so the heat would be distributed a little bit better stuff. But I hope it shows you guys that your core layout and slicing, there's not too many more ways you can stack all these parts together. In this particular size, the parts, no matter how you stack them, if you put more cylinders, you're getting less carbs. If you put more carbs, you're getting less cylinders. And it actually just works out to be all the same. It's just whether or not you can put another 1 block layer all the way around here with efficiency parts and keep the density as high as possible. And in that particular case, this motor wins out because of this one single fact that 1 pipe can collect 8 exhaust, and everything just lays out more efficiency at that. So I hope that guy shows you that your core is very important. A more properly laid out core is very important. There's not too much from going by a 12 carb 2-way sharing to an 8 carb 3-way sharing, and that there is some difference between 8 carb 3-way sharing and a different layout with 3-way carb sharing, that one just doesn't work, the other one just works perfectly. But using less cylinders with more power per fuel doesn't necessarily gain anything over more cylinders with medium power per fuel or offset, and versus trying to take the best from all motors and pack it into one and make it more efficient for, I guess, set up more efficiency in your layout of your efficiency parts. And I'll see you guys in the next one.